Inside Leeuwkop, South Africa's infamous maximum prison. Documentary. Imagine being locked away in a place where the rules of society no longer apply. A place where survival depends on alliances, power, and sheer will. This is Leeuwkop Maximum Correctional Center, a fortress of secrets hidden behind high walls and barbed wire. Few dare to investigate what happens here, but today, you're about to step inside. From its grim history to the lives of inmates and the corruption within, Leeuwkop holds a mirror to South Africa's deepest struggles. Why is this prison so notorious? What stories lie buried within its cells? Welcome to Mzansi Origins, where we expose the untold truths. In this episode, we explore Leeuwkop Maximum Prison, a place that's more than just a correctional facility. It's a microcosm of crime, power, and broken systems. Brace yourself for a journey into a world that's both shocking and fascinating. We'll uncover stories of survival, betrayal, and redemption. By the end, you'll see Leeuwkop not just as a prison, but as a symbol of South Africa's justice system and its failures. The history of Leeuwkop Prison. Leeuwkop Maximum Correctional Center wasn't always the imposing fortress it is today. Its story began humbly in 1903 when the South African government converted farmland into a prison. Initially, it was designed to house petty criminals and debtors, but over time, its purpose evolved. During the apartheid era, Leeuwkop became a symbol of oppression, holding political dissidents and activists fighting for freedom. Stories of torture and forced labor from this period still haunt its corridors. One particularly chilling tale involves detainees being made to break rocks under the scorching sun, their cries drowned out by guards' laughter. After apartheid, Leeuwkop expanded, becoming one of the largest correctional facilities in the country. Its population swelled with dangerous criminals, making it a hub for gang activity and violence. But Leeuwkop's transformation wasn't just physical. It became a microcosm of South Africa's fractured society. Wealthy inmates bribed guards for better treatment, while the poor were left to suffer. Today, it houses over 4,000 inmates, including murderers, gang leaders, and high-profile criminals. Its reputation as a school of crime continues to grow, raising questions about whether it truly rehabilitates or simply hardens its residents. The layout and conditions inside. Leeuwkop's layout is a maze of towering walls, heavy steel gates, and narrow hallways. The prison is divided into several units: maximum security for dangerous offenders, medium security for less violent criminals, and a juvenile section for younger offenders. At first glance, the prison appears orderly, but step inside and a different reality unfolds. Overcrowding is a glaring issue, with cells built for 20 often housing over 40 inmates. Mattresses line the floors, and the stench of unwashed bodies fills the air. Inmates share a single toilet, leading to fights over basic hygiene. Food is scarce and often of poor quality: watery porridge for breakfast and bread for dinner. These harsh conditions breed resentment and tension, often erupting into violence. Beyond physical discomfort, the psychological toll is immense. Many inmates suffer from depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Access to mental health care is limited, and suicide attempts are not uncommon. The guards, overwhelmed and underpaid, struggle to maintain order. Corruption thrives, with contraband like drugs and cell phones flowing freely. Leeuwkop's conditions are more than just inhumane. They reveal a system overwhelmed by its own failures. Life of an inmate. Imagine waking up every morning to the sound of metal clanging and guards shouting orders. For inmates at Leeuwkop, this is their daily reality. Life begins before dawn, with roll calls and strict routines. Each day is a struggle, not just for survival, but for dignity. Overcrowded cells force inmates to sleep on the floor, crammed next to strangers who could be allies or enemies. Personal belongings are scarce, often stolen or traded for food and cigarettes. The little time spent outside is under constant surveillance, with tensions simmering between rival gangs. The numbers gangs, the 26, 27, and 28, rule the social order, dictating who gets protection and who is left vulnerable. New inmates face brutal initiation rites to join these gangs, often involving violence or humiliating tasks. Those who resist gang life are often isolated, becoming easy targets for exploitation, rehabilitation, or punishment. The question of whether Leeuwkop is a place for rehabilitation or just punishment has been hotly debated for years. Officially, South Africa's correctional system promotes rehabilitation, offering programs to help inmates reintegrate into society. At Leeuwkop, these programs range from education and job training to religious services and psychological counseling. But despite these efforts, many inmates find themselves trapped in a cycle of crime and despair. The prison's overcrowding limits the effectiveness of these programs, leaving little room for individual attention. Education is often seen as a luxury, with many inmates too preoccupied with survival to focus on learning. For those who do participate, the programs are often underfunded and lack the resources necessary to make a lasting impact. The prison's healthcare system is equally strained, with inadequate mental health care and long waiting lists for treatment. This neglect leads to a high rate of self-harm and suicide attempts. While some inmates manage to turn their lives around, the overwhelming majority find themselves returning to crime after release. Statistics show that more than 70% of South African prisoners are rearrested within 5 years of their release. This high rate of recidivism calls into question the effectiveness of Leeuwkop's approach. Critics argue that the prison system prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation, focusing more on containment than on changing behavior. Leeuwkop, with its brutal conditions and entrenched gangs, often serves to reinforce criminality rather than reform. The real question is, can a prison like Leeuwkop truly rehabilitate its residents, or is it just a breeding ground for further crime? The answer may lie in the broader failings of South Africa's criminal justice system. Corruption behind bars. Corruption is one of the darkest secrets of Leeuwkop Maximum Correctional Center. From the highest-ranking officials to the lowest-paid guards, the prison is riddled with bribery, smuggling, and exploitation. Inmates, desperate for better treatment, often resort to bribing prison staff for privileges. These bribes are paid in the form of money, drugs, or valuable contraband that's smuggled into the prison. Some guards turn a blind eye to the flow of illegal goods, while others actively participate in trafficking. The prison's underground economy thrives on this corruption, with inmates selling drugs, cell phones, and weapons, all of which have been brought in through corrupt officials. At times, whole units are under the control of gang leaders who have struck deals with corrupt staff. These leaders operate with relative impunity, knowing they can rely on the complicity of prison guards. The violence and intimidation they wield is often ignored by the very people charged with maintaining order. Corruption extends beyond the prison walls, with officials receiving kickbacks from criminals on the outside. Investigations into these practices are rare, and even when they do occur, they often lead nowhere, further reinforcing a culture of impunity. The danger is not just in the criminal activity of the inmates, but in the system itself, which allows such corruption to flourish. It's a vicious cycle. Corruption enables crime, and crime breeds more corruption. This dynamic makes it nearly impossible for genuine reforms to take place at Leeuwkop. For inmates, the realization is harsh. Justice is not always administered by the law, but by those in power. The corrupted system at Leeuwkop is a reflection of the larger issues facing South Africa's prison network, where corruption can often be more powerful than the law. The struggle for basic human rights. One of the most shocking aspects of life inside Leeuwkop is the constant struggle for basic human rights. Inmates, already living in harsh conditions, are often denied fundamental needs like access to clean water, proper food, and health care. Many prisoners have to fight for even the most basic privileges, and these battles are often futile. Overcrowding exacerbates the problem, with hundreds of inmates forced to live in cells designed for far fewer people. This lack of space leads to physical and psychological strain as prisoners endure long hours in cramped, uncomfortable conditions. The prison's healthcare system is woefully inadequate, with limited medical staff and poor access to medications. Inmates with serious medical conditions often have to wait months for treatment, while others are left to suffer in silence. The lack of sanitation and proper hygiene leads to outbreaks of diseases like tuberculosis, which spread rapidly in such close quarters. Inmates who complain or try to address these issues are often met with harsh retaliation. Those who stand up for their rights are seen as troublemakers, subject to solitary confinement or even violent punishment. This systemic abuse creates a cycle of dehumanization that makes it nearly impossible for prisoners to hold on to their dignity. Advocates for prisoners' rights argue that the conditions at Leeuwkop violate international human rights laws, yet the prison continues to operate with little oversight. Human rights organizations have called for reform, but progress is slow as the government struggles to address the overwhelming challenges facing the country's correctional system. The story of Leeuwkop is a reminder that, for many, incarceration is not just a punishment for crime, it's a sentence to live without basic human decency. The inmates at Leeuwkop may have broken the law, but they too are entitled to the fundamental rights that make them human. Yet for many, these rights are as elusive as the hope of freedom. The power of the media. The media plays a significant role in shaping public perception of Leeuwkop and South Africa's prison system as a whole. News reports often focus on the most shocking stories, violent outbreaks, escapes, and infamous inmates. This coverage keeps the prison in the public eye, but it rarely paints a full picture of life inside. For many, Leeuwkop is a symbol of the country's failing justice system, and the media often amplifies this narrative without offering much in the way of solutions. Sensational headlines about gang wars or prison riots overshadow the deeper issues, like overcrowding and inadequate healthcare, which remain largely ignored. However, investigative journalists have uncovered the darker sides of Leeuwkop, shedding light on corruption, human rights violations, and systemic abuses. These stories are often met with resistance, as the prison system is notorious for silencing whistleblowers. Despite this, media exposure has led to some reforms, though progress is slow and often insufficient. One of the most controversial media revelations was the discovery of illicit relationships between prison staff and inmates. These revelations sparked public outrage, but the actual consequences were minimal, showing just how entrenched the corruption is. The media, despite its efforts, can only do so much when it comes to instigating real change. Public outcry may bring temporary reforms, but without sustained pressure, the system often returns to its status quo. For the inmates, however, the media attention can sometimes provide a sense of hope that their voices might be heard, even if they are often reduced to numbers and headlines. The media's role in shaping the narrative of Leeuwkop is crucial. It both exposes the system's flaws and, at times, reinforces them. But the true story is not just about what happens in the public eye, it's about what happens behind closed doors. The future of Leeuwkop. The future of Leeuwkop is uncertain, with calls for reform becoming louder, but achieving little tangible change. As one of South Africa's most notorious prisons, it is difficult to envision a future where conditions improve without significant intervention. The prison's overcrowding problem is a pressing issue, with the number of inmates far exceeding its capacity. This strain on resources affects everything, from security to healthcare to education. Government officials have promised improvements, but these promises often fall short, leaving Leeuwkop stuck in a cycle of neglect. The issue of corruption remains a major hurdle, as many of the very people tasked with reforming the system are part of the problem. While there are occasional bursts of reform, they are often short-lived, and the prison returns to its corrupt and abusive practices. To truly change Leeuwkop, South Africa would need to overhaul its entire correctional system, including reforming its approach to rehabilitation. Many experts argue that focusing on rehabilitation, education, and mental health services would lead to a safer and more effective prison environment. However, the political will to make such changes is often lacking, with the focus primarily on punishment and containment. The gains within Leeuwkop will continue to hold sway as long as there is a lack of accountability and proper rehabilitation. For those incarcerated, hope for change is often a fleeting illusion, as the harsh reality of daily life leaves little room for optimism. And yet, there are small victories, reforms here and there, prisoners who manage to escape the cycle of violence and crime. The path forward is unclear, but unless serious efforts are made to address the root causes of the prison's dysfunction, Leeuwkop will continue to stand as a testament to the failures of the South African correctional system. In the end, the future of Leeuwkop depends on the willingness of both the government and the public to confront its many flaws and demand real change. The role of prison gangs. At Leeuwkop, gang activity is not just a part of the prison culture, it's central to it. Prison gangs operate with a structure that mirrors organized crime on the outside, and they exert an overwhelming amount of control over both the inmates and the prison staff. Some gangs, like the 26, 27, and 28, dominate Leeuwkop, and their influence extends far beyond the prison walls. These gangs control everything from the distribution of contraband to the management of violence within the prison. They also play a significant role in enforcing discipline among inmates, often punishing those who break the unwritten rules of the prison. In return for their cooperation, gang leaders offer protection to other inmates, making it nearly impossible to survive without joining one of these groups. The gang's grip on Leeuwkop is so strong that even the prison guards are often powerless to challenge their authority. Corruption within the ranks of the prison staff only strengthens the gang's position, allowing them to operate with near impunity. For new inmates, the choice is stark: join a gang for protection or face a life of constant fear and violence. But for those who align themselves with the gangs, life inside becomes a constant struggle for power, control, and survival. The gang leaders dictate everything, from who gets special privileges to who gets punished for breaking the rules. Violence between rival gangs is common, with bloody turf wars breaking out in the yard or in the hallways. Life after Leeuwkop, re-entry, and recidivism. For many of Leeuwkop's inmates, life after prison is a grim prospect. The challenges of reintegrating into society after serving time in a maximum security prison are overwhelming, and the system often fails to offer meaningful support. For one thing, many former prisoners leave Leeuwkop with few skills, limited education, and little more than a criminal record. Without access to job training or support programs during their time in prison, finding work becomes nearly impossible. For many, the only option is to return to a life of crime, as their experiences inside the prison often lead them down that path. South Africa's high unemployment rate only exacerbates this issue, as released prisoners struggle to find legal employment opportunities. With little support and no skills, the temptation to reoffend is strong. Recidivism rates are alarmingly high, with many former inmates rearrested within just a few years of their release. The lack of social support for reintegration means that many prisoners find themselves isolated from their families and communities. Instead of being welcomed back into society, they are stigmatized and treated as pariahs. This only reinforces the cycle of crime and punishment, creating a revolving door between the streets and Leeuwkop. While some individuals manage to turn their lives around after serving time, the odds are stacked against them. The lack of rehabilitation and reintegration programs at Leeuwkop contributes to this problem, leaving former inmates ill-prepared to face the outside world. Those who do attempt to rebuild their lives often encounter insurmountable obstacles. and even those who manage to stay out of trouble often live in the shadows, haunted by the stigma of their past. The question remains, how can South Africa break the cycle of recidivism and offer real opportunities for change? Until the correctional system undergoes significant reform, the chances for success after Leeuwkop will remain slim for most. The strain on South Africa's correctional system. Leeuwkop is not an isolated example, but rather a reflection of the broader problems plaguing South Africa's entire correctional system. The country's prisons are overcrowded, underfunded, and rife with issues that make rehabilitation nearly impossible. At Leeuwkop, this strain is particularly evident, with the prison operating well above its capacity and lacking the necessary resources to address the needs of its inmates. The state of the infrastructure is crumbling, with outdated facilities that have not been adequately maintained in years. This includes not only the physical infrastructure, such as cells and plumbing, but also the staffing levels, which are dangerously low. With understaffed security and support staff, the prison becomes vulnerable to the influence of gangs and corruption. Attempts to address these issues have been hampered by chronic underfunding from the government, which often prioritizes other areas over prison reform. The lack of resources means that basic services, such as healthcare, education, and vocational training, are either non-existent or grossly inadequate. Inmates face constant overcrowding, which leads to rising tensions and escalates violence within the prison. But the strain on the correctional system is not just about the prisons themselves, it's about what happens before and after incarceration. Without significant changes to the way South Africa deals with crime, imprisonment, and rehabilitation, prisons like Leeuwkop will continue to be overcrowded, violent, and ineffective. The country's criminal justice system, from arrest to sentencing, is stretched thin, and the lack of long-term solutions only worsens the cycle of crime. The entire system is failing those it's meant to serve: the victims, the criminals, and the broader society. Behind the concrete walls of Leeuwkop, the voices of the inmates are often ignored or silenced. For many, being incarcerated means losing their humanity in the eyes of society, but it's within these walls that we get a glimpse into the harsh realities of the prison system. In interviews with former prisoners, the stories of brutality, fear, and survival come to life. Inmates speak of the constant threat of violence, the pervasive culture of corruption, and the struggles to maintain dignity in a place designed to strip it away. Some talk about their experiences with gang violence, while others describe the psychological toll of living in constant confinement. There are stories of men who entered the system with small offenses, only to emerge hardened criminals due to the environment they were placed in. For them, Leeuwkop is not a place of reform, but a crucible where they were molded by the harshness around them. But not all stories are of despair. There are voices of those who have found ways to survive mentally, emotionally, and even spiritually within the prison system. Some inmates turn to education, others to religion, and some to art as a way of expressing their humanity despite the inhumane conditions. These voices from inside show that even in the darkest corners of South Africa's prisons, there is a yearning for change, for redemption, and for hope. But it's clear that those who seek reform within the system are often punished or ignored. Still, the resilience of the human spirit shines through in the testimonies of those who endure. The prison may try to break them, but the inmates of Leeuwkop continue to fight for their lives, even in the face of overwhelming odds. These voices are not just important for understanding life inside Leeuwkop. They are vital for understanding the need for systemic reform in South Africa's correctional facilities. The stories from the inside are a call to action for those on the outside. Corruption at Leeuwkop is not just an occasional anomaly, it is deeply embedded within the prison's culture. This corruption stretches from the top of the chain of command to the lowest levels, with prison guards and officials frequently complicit in the illicit activities that take place behind bars. From smuggling contraband such as drugs, cell phones, and weapons, to facilitating violence or orchestrating illegal trade, the prison's leadership often turns a blind eye. In many instances, corrupt officials are paid off to ignore gang activities or to grant certain inmates privileges that others can only dream of. But it's not just the officials who are corrupt. The gangs themselves have been known to bribe their way into positions of power within the prison system. This system of corruption creates a vicious cycle where inmates who should be punished for their actions are often rewarded, and those who try to abide by the rules face harsh retaliation. As a result, the prison environment becomes one where trust is non-existent, and inmates must rely on their connections to survive. For many of the officers, turning a blind eye to the illicit activities occurring around them is simply a matter of survival. Those who challenge the status quo are often transferred or retaliated against. For Leeuwkop to change, it will need a massive overhaul of its leadership structure and an honest reckoning with the deep-seated corruption that holds it in place. In the absence of genuine accountability, the cycle of abuse, manipulation, and exploitation will continue. The corrupt nature of the institution only exacerbates the challenges of reforming Leeuwkop. As long as corruption is left unchecked, those in power will continue to perpetuate a system that benefits the few at the expense of the many. The real question is, how much longer can Leeuwkop survive under the weight of its own corruption? Until something changes. Rehabilitation at Leeuwkop is a concept that, unfortunately, does not match the reality of life inside. The primary focus of the prison is on containment and punishment, not on rehabilitation or reintegration. With overcrowding and limited resources, there are few programs in place to help inmates reform, and those that do exist are often underfunded and poorly managed. Educational programs are sparse and vocational training is even rarer, meaning that most inmates leave the prison with no skills that would help them reintegrate into society. As a result, many former inmates return to lives of crime, contributing to the high rates of recidivism in South Africa. Even basic rehabilitation programs such as counseling or anger management are limited, leaving inmates to fend for themselves mentally and emotionally. The lack of support and education leads to frustration, and for many, crime inside the prison becomes a means of survival. The system seems to punish inmates for their crimes, but offers them no path to change or redemption. The absence of rehabilitation perpetuates a vicious cycle where prisoners leave more hardened and less capable of integrating into society. Those who attempt to change often find themselves met with obstacles both inside and outside the prison walls. For many, the failure of rehabilitation is the most crushing part of their sentence. It is a reminder that the system views them as irredeemable. Until the South African correctional system prioritizes rehabilitation over punishment, prisons like Leeuwkop will continue to fail those who need help the most. The true measure of a correctional facility should not be how many inmates it houses, but how many it helps transform. In Leeuwkop, transformation is not the goal, survival is. Without meaningful rehabilitation, the prison will continue to churn out repeat offenders, perpetuating a system that only exacerbates the problem of crime. The cries for reform from within Leeuwkop and from the public are growing louder, but they are met with little more than empty promises. Many believe that the prison system needs a complete overhaul, one that focuses on rehabilitation, education, and reducing overcrowding. Prisoners should be treated with dignity and given the opportunity to rebuild their lives, but instead, they are subjected to a system that breaks them down further. Activists, former inmates, and even some politicians are calling for a shift away from punitive measures towards restorative justice, but such efforts face immense opposition. The South African government, despite acknowledging the issues in the correctional system, has yet to take decisive action. The problem, many argue, is not just about funding, but about political will. There simply isn't enough political will to tackle the prison crisis head-on. Until systemic corruption is rooted out and resources are allocated to proper rehabilitation programs, prisons like Leeuwkop will continue to serve as warehouses for criminals, not as spaces for reform. The public must demand accountability from those in power, not just for the sake of the prisoners, but for the sake of society as a whole. Without proper rehabilitation, former inmates re-enter society as time bombs, and the cycle of crime continues. The reality is that reform will take years, possibly decades, and requires a fundamental shift in how South Africa approaches crime and punishment. But the alternative is a future where prisons like Leeuwkop continue to operate as they always have, overcrowded, corrupt, and utterly incapable of changing the lives of the people inside. The call for reform is not just a plea for better conditions, but for a more just and humane system that offers prisoners a chance to reclaim their lives. The question is whether South Africa is ready to answer that call. Only time will tell.